see that it's showing record. All right, wait a second. Let me.
It is recording. I could see it on my end.
You're muted now, Carrie.
Okay. I wanted to welcome everybody to tonight's event. This is the third of the Horizon series for 2021. Last year was aborted after only one, so we're very excited that we've been able to put together a Horizon series for all, for members, for non-members, and it's free and open to the public. So, you know, the more the merrier. And we have one more after this. And Martin, when you're on, if you would just make mention of that and the date and the speaker, that would be great. So for those of you that aren't familiar with Tallahassee Scientific Society, we're a little nonprofit in town that's mostly known for the Horizon series that we have offered for, I think, up to a decade as a series of talks in the spring. And we bring in speakers from out of town, from anywhere in the country, and they provide us just a really enriching presentation. And we take them out into the community during their stay here, before or after their talk, to expand their footprint in Tallahassee. And we take them to classrooms. Here is Dr. David Kaiser. He gave a presentation on early cosmology. And we took him to the Sail Robotics Club, and he gave a little presentation to them, and then they gave him a tour of the robotics lab. And this is him. Previously, the talks have been held for the most part in the Challenger Auditorium. We also have field trips that are open to the public. And we had a Horizons printer, Dr. Greg Erickson. He's a paleobiologist, and he has a lab at FSU. So he offered a field trip in his lab and showed the participants all sorts of different fossils and things like that. It was pretty neat. And we also have field trips where we're out and about. And this one is to Cape San Blas that was mostly washed away with a hurricane. And so we went to look at how things had changed. This was a field trip to the power plant. And we try to get out and about in the community and let them know who we are and who we are about. We're really trying to meet the needs of the community as far as offering opportunities in science experiences or enrichment, better understanding of scientific process. And we are looking forward to helping some of the different venues around town in the summertime fund some scholarships for their for students in our community, K through 12, that wouldn't be able to come up with a couple $100 per camp. So we're looking forward to impacting our community in that way. Okay, and I'm Carrie Maddox. This is what I always forget. I'm Carrie Maddox. I'm the president of Tallahassee Scientific Society, and we have a superb board of directors, and Martin Brimmer is one of our board members, and he has been just, we couldn't have done the Horizon series without him. So thank you, Martin, very much for helping us with this. And now I'm going to end my slideshow, and I am going to let you take over. So I think you can, or you, Kat, you turn on. Tell me what I need to do. I'm done with what I wanted to say.
Well, great. I will do a brief introduction for Dr. Volk as you are switching over the hosting abilities to her. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. As I joined the Tallahassee Scientific Society and was getting into the various aspects of options of things to help out the group as a whole. I was particularly interested in the Horizons lecture series. I've had a number of good professors and a lot of people that I've had experience with that would be great for actually having the ability to give a talk and give some real substance as well to the group and the community at large. So some of the first people I thought of were professor I had, other people I know that are doing great things within the scientific community. So the last one was Fritz Davis. He is a professor I've had here at FSU for history of science. And then I reached out to my friends who are practicing scientists and doing really interesting research. So Dr. Volk is someone that I was a student with at undergrad. We both did a degree in physics. I represented the low end of the tier for physics students, and she was top tier and has since gone on to Arizona State and gotten her PhD in planetary sciences, has worked in numerous locations and research facilities, has secured many, many grants from NASA and other such organizations to do really interesting work on the dynamic history of the outer solar system, the Kuiper belt, and is continuing to. My dogs are quite excited about the introduction to Dr. Volk, so they are participating right now. Thank you, and I apologize. And so this was an opportunity to showcase not only some of the great work that's being done currently with NASA, with Arizona State, but also kind of a nod towards the fact that you can get a really good science education at small liberal arts schools as well and do some really great work. To that end, next month on April 15th, we are also going to have Dr. Jen Locke. She's a material scientist currently at Ohio State University. You'll hear this again next month, but she's won an NSF career grant or career award already. And so that'll be a really good presentation as well. For those of you that like to put off your taxes, apparently your filing is due a month later now, so don't worry about showing up on April 15th for the meeting itself. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Volk. Very excited to have you present and excited to hear everything you're talking about tonight.
All right, well, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be talking to all of you this evening. So I'm going to share my screen here. So hopefully you are seeing my slides. Martin, can you confirm that?
Yep, I see them on my screen.
Yes.
Excellent. All right, so as Martin said, I am a planetary scientist. I do a lot of work on the outer solar system and a little bit of work on exoplanets as well. I decided a cool topic that I find really exciting that's been in the news a lot the last couple of years would be a great topic for this talk. And that is our recent interstellar visitors to the solar system, One-Eye Oumuamua and Two-Eye Borisov. But before we start about the interstellar visitors, I want to get everybody on the same page with the small body populations in the solar system, because that's going to be our important point of comparison when looking at these interstellar visitors. And by the way, if there are questions during the talk, you can put those in the Zoom chat if there's a clarification question. But we'll have plenty of time afterwards for questions too. But yeah, if there's something that's confusing, I find that having the chat option is good for during the talk. So here is an overview look on a log scale of all of the small body populations in the solar system and their relationship to the planets. So we start on the far left here with the sun. We have the terrestrial planets here. The Earth, of course, is at 1 astronomical unit. That's how we define the astronomical unit. And then this goes out in increments, factors of 10, from 10 to 100, and then all the way out to 100,000 AU. And then on the far right is our nearest stellar neighbor for scale Alpha Centauri. So within the solar system, we have a really wide diversity of small body populations. In the inner solar system, I'm sure everybody's heard a lot about the near Earth asteroids or near Earth objects. Those are the rocky bodies that are on Earth crossing trajectories in the inner solar system. So those are the ones we tend to worry about impacting the Earth. Between Mars and Jupiter is the main asteroid belt. So that is the source of the near Earth asteroids. We have the Centaur population, is what we call the objects that orbit between Jupiter and Neptune. And then out past Neptune, we have the Kuiper belt or trans-Neptunian population. The name depends on kind of your preference. So Gerard Kuiper, who founded my department, so I work at the Lunar and Planetary Lab, which is headquartered in the Kuiper building on the University of Arizona campus. He actually predicted that the Kuiper belt shouldn't exist, and then somehow it got named after him, which kind of annoyed the Europeans. So the Europeans and Canadians tend to call it the trans-Neptunian population instead of the Kuiper belt, because Edgeworth was a European scientist who was also publishing about it at the time. But so interesting history there, rivalries. And then as we go out even further in the solar system, we have the Oort cloud. So these are objects that are just barely gravitationally bound to the sun. So very weakly bound. They're actually significantly perturbed by stars that happen to pass near the solar system as the sun is making its path around the galaxy. And they get knocked into the inner solar system onto long period comet orbits. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the Oort cloud later in the talk. And then of course, there are also inner solar system comets, which aren't really shown on this plot, but short period comets that originate from the Kuiper belt that also go into the inner solar system. So that's kind of our orientation. To zoom in, this is just a top-down view of some of these small body populations. So we've got Jupiter on the outside here in the terrestrial planets. So this is a plot of a large number of known main belt asteroids. There's also Jupiter Trojan asteroids. We in planetary science like to give names to a lot of different small body populations. There's also Hilda asteroids. You can see a little bit of the near Earth asteroids. So lots of small bodies. These tend to be relatively rocky objects as opposed to icy objects. So these are things that don't tend to outgas when they come into the inner solar system. Again, that will come up later when we talk about our interstellar visitors. If we zoom out and we now have these circles that represent the giant planet orbits, we have Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. And so for sense of scale, Neptune is 30 times as far from the sun as the Earth is, so 30 astronomical units. And then these white dots are the known trans-Neptunian objects, and then the white dots crossing the planets here are the known centaurs. So those are the observed, directly observed populations in the solar system. So these are all things that we have tracked on the sky. We observe them in reflected sunlight and we see their motion. But then there's the one even more distant Oort cloud population of bodies, which we infer. We cannot directly observe the Oort cloud because they're so far away. So you can see in this zoom out, this tiny blue box is the Kuiper belt with everything else in the solar system interior to that. And then the Oort cloud is even further out. So we can't directly observe the Oort cloud, but we can infer its existence from the fact that we do observe those long period comets that come into the inner solar system when gravitational interactions with stuff outside the solar system sends them in. And there's lots of really interesting structures that we think are present in the Oort cloud. You can see that there's a little bit of a concentration near the plane of the planets, but then external forces have allowed the rest of these orbits to kind of get sphericalized around the solar system, which is why we call it a cloud. So that's kind of the very, very brief version of all of the expected small bodies that we might observe as we're surveying the night sky for objects, which then brings us to our first confirmed interstellar visitor that was observed in 2017. So this is an object that, so this plot is showing you the orbits of the giant planets in the solar system, so the solar system's plane. This object came basically in from the north, down, zoomed past the sun. So this is a zoomed in version of the interaction here. And there's kind of a normal solar system comet orbit here shown for scale. So this object zoomed past the sun, and then it zoomed past the Earth, and it was actually discovered on its way out of the solar system. So in October of 2017, the Pan-STARRS survey, which is a survey that is typically looking for near-Earth objects, picked up this object in its nightly observations and quickly realized, based on its motion against the night sky, that this was no ordinary asteroid or comet, that instead of having a nice closed path representing its orbit around the sun, it was on a hyperbolic orbit. So it is coming in, interacting with the sun, which changes its direction, and then it is leaving to never come back again. So that was really exciting. We have been looking for interstellar objects for pretty much as long as we've been surveying the sky, and this is the first time we've actually seen one. But before we talk more about the observations of Oumuamua itself, why would we even expect there to be interstellar objects floating around the galaxy for us to observe? So to understand that, we have to go back to planet formation and star and planet formation. So this is a little movie version of what we think happens when you have a star that is forming. So remember, stars form when you have a bunch of gas and dust that condenses locally at the center. You have this star forming that's getting really hot and it's spinning. The angular momentum causes all the other gas and dust in the system to form out into a disk. And then you can build up planets and small bodies out of that disk. So that's just kind of the conceptual thing this movie is showing. And you get gaps where you've cleared out the material because planets have formed. And over time, the gas dissipates and you're left with a planetary system like our solar system. And this was just a nice movie representation, but the really cool thing about living now is that we can actually observe these things in the real world. So this is an actual image of a protoplanetary disk in which planets are forming around a nearby star HL Tau. So this is taken with ALMA at really long wavelengths, but it's remarkable how close it is to kind of our pictures of how this happened in the early solar system. So you have this gas and dust disk around the star, and you're starting to see gaps, which is likely related to planet formation in this really baby star that's only a couple million years old. So when you do actually start forming solid objects in a planetary system, they're going to interact. And this is where the history of our own solar system can teach us something about kind of generic planetary formation processes. So over the years, we have developed better and better theories as to exactly how and when the solar system's planets formed. And our current best picture is that the giant planets in our solar system formed a little bit closer together and a little bit on average closer to the sun than where we find them today. So we think Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune formed kind of inside about 15 to 20 AU. So remember, Neptune today is at 30 AU. So we think it formed significantly closer to the sun. And when it formed, they were embedded in a massive planetesimal disk. So planetesimals are just the small bodies that form in this protoplanetary disk. And they probably form the seeds for the larger objects like the giant planets. But you also get this wide range of things, from things that are a few tens of meters across to many hundreds to thousands of kilometers across. And you have this massive disk that forms alongside the planets. And what happens when these forming planets interact with a massive disk is that they can exchange energy and exchange angular momentum, and the planets will end up getting redistributed as they interact with this disk of planetesimals. And that's why we went from this more compact configuration to the current giant planet configuration. So this movie is just going to show a simulation of this process. So this is not the formation of our solar system, but just a generic planetary system. And what we're seeing here on this plot, the x-axis is the average distance from the sun. And we've got 3 massive planets in this system. And then these dark blue particles here represent an external planetesimal disk. So these are particles in a numerical simulation that have mass. They're going to interact with the planets, and that's going to cause a redistribution of these objects in the system. The y-axis is just telling us how elongated the orbits are. So are we talking circular orbits or cometary-like orbits that have very large eccentricities? So we think that when the planets formed and when planetesimals formed, they should form on roughly circular orbits. And then when they interact over time, their orbits become less circular. So we're going to go ahead and let this movie play. And you can see the time in the upper right. So you can see instantaneously, as soon as you let the planets start interacting with this massive disk of particles, just everything gets all tossed up. And the planets spread apart. And just like in our solar system, the outermost planet here basically zoomed outwards, because when we look back at the start, so it's going to see this initial disk here, and it's immediately going to start having close encounters with that disk, and it's going to toss massive objects inward. And because it tosses those objects inward, the planet has to move outward in response. And that's how we end up with this really rapid outward migration of the planet as it goes out. So this is not exactly what happened in our solar system, but it's very similar, and it's a generic process. So we started, this is obviously not to scale, with our giant planets, and exterior to the giant planets, we had what we like to refer to as kind of the proto-Kuiper belt. So this massive disk of icy planetesimals. And then the planets migrate, they've dispersed most of those planetesimals, but where do those planetesimals actually go as they interact? So they kind of go all over the solar system. So some of them will get tossed into the inner solar system. There's some theories that part of the Earth's water that makes up our current oceans might have come from the outer solar system during this migration process. Some can get implanted into the Jupiter, Trojan, and asteroid belt populations. They go all over the giant planet region. Some get left over in the outer solar system, and that's the Kuiper belt that we see today. A bunch of the objects that were in the giant planet region when the planets are forming gets ejected out into the Oort cloud. But some of those things get such a large kick from the giant planets as they're interacting that they become unbound from the sun. So they actually get ejected into interstellar space. So, you know, the Oort cloud are the things that just barely didn't get enough energy to be completely ejected, but we form basically we send a massive amount of litter into the galaxy during this migration process. And, you know, this is just a natural consequence. When you form planets, you also form small bodies. We see evidence for Kuiper belts around other stars, just like that nice image of HL Tau I showed earlier. We can take images of older stars and see dust from collisions. So dust is warm in the infrared. So you can actually infer populations of Kuiper belts and asteroid belts by observing the dust from collisions within those populations. So we know, other stars have lots of small body disks. We know that there are a lot of exoplanets out there. So this process of forming an Oort cloud and kicking things out into interstellar space is a generic outcome of the planet formation process. And in fact, there's even a theory that when the sun was forming, that we might have actually exchanged Oort cloud objects with other nearby stars. So the sun is currently not in a stellar cluster. It's just on its own orbit around the galaxy, but we think that when the sun formed, it was part of a cluster of stars that all formed at the same time. And when the sun was very young, when that cluster was still intact, you had kind of the massive amount of gas that allowed this local concentration of star formation. That gas held the stellar cluster together gravitationally. And over time, as the stars form and kind of turn on, their own radiation will basically clear out that gas from the cluster. So the cluster disperses after the stars have formed. But if you can form planets and form Oort clouds really early in the sun's history, when it was still in this stellar birth cluster, it's possible we actually captured some of our current Oort cloud from our stellar neighbors. So that's what this little movie is going to show. The red dot here is the sun. This is just a model of some, random hypothesized stellar cluster we might have formed in. The little green dots around the sun and all of the other stars in this simulation are Oort cloud objects around those stars. And then the blue dots are Oort cloud objects from other stars that our star is going to capture. So, the stars interact with each other. They have close passages. They strip objects off each other as things are going on. Then the gas disperses and the stars all go their own direction. And the sun goes its own direction, now accompanied by a bunch of comets that it is captured from other stars. So we might, in fact, have interstellar objects in our own Oort cloud, but they were captured very early in the sun's history. So there's also a theory that we might have even ejected an entire ice giant planet when we were undergoing this planet migration and rearrangement. So there are some models showing the outward migration of the planets. So this is a simulation of Jupiter, Saturn, an ejected ice giant, Uranus, and Neptune. And there are reasons to think that allowing a close encounter between Saturn or Jupiter and an ice giant and kicking that ice giant out into interstellar space helps solve some problems in our early solar system models. Those exact problems are fairly esoteric and complicated, but it's kind of fun to think that ejecting a Uranus or a Neptune could help. And in fact, there are surveys, microlensing surveys, so gravitational microlensing, where you look for temporary brightenings of stars that indicate that a massive object has passed nearby and bent the light to temporarily make the star appear brighter. And there are estimates that there are billions, possibly, of free-floating planets in the galaxy that are large. So it's not a totally wild idea that we might have, on top of ejecting a bunch of small bodies, we might have ejected an entire planet. But back to ejecting just the small bodies. If we think about how much mass we might have ejected from our own solar system to get the giant planets from where we think they formed to where they are today, the estimates are that it's something like 10 to 30 Earth masses worth of small bodies. And in fact, that's really quite consistent with estimates of how much material must be floating around the galaxy to explain having observed our first interstellar object in 2017. So a group out of Northern Arizona University, sat and thought about, okay, how long have we been surveying the sky with modern digital cameras? They said, okay, in 2017, the answer was, we've been pretty seriously surveying for 10 or 15 years. And looking at the efficiencies and how hard it is to detect really small objects, they came up with this kind of mass map that says, okay, having observed a 100-meter object with this specific density implies something between 10 to the 1 and 10 to the 1.5 Earth masses of free-floating small bodies in the galaxy, which is right in line with how much we think our own, and that's per star, sorry. This is amount of mass ejected per star that's free-floating in the galaxy. And that's right in line with what we think we ejected from our own solar system. Because we need about 10 to 30 Earth masses in this early Kuiper belt to allow the angular momentum exchange to get Neptune out to where it is. The current mass of the Kuiper belt is a very tiny fraction of that. So most of this material is now gone. So in that sense, it makes perfect sense that we saw Oumuamua. So but back to Oumuamua, because that's about the only thing about Oumuamua that makes perfect sense. So this was the discovery paper describing this newly discovered interstellar asteroid. This is the actual discovery image here in panel A. You can see that it is a very faint streak in the image. So that means it was moving fairly fast to be able to move across many pixels, even in one frame. But they were able to detect that, and then they did follow up to track the object and recover it. And just as a reminder, we see objects by looking for their motion against the background stars. So objects that are within our own solar system, if we image the sky multiple times over one night or over multiple nights, things that are in the solar system will move relative to the stationary background stars. Part of that motion is due to parallax. So the Earth is moving along in its orbit. So we are a moving, observing platform. And just like when you're watching nearby objects, you know, the parallax effect of having the observer move will make it appear to move against more distant background objects. But of course, things that are zooming through the solar system are also moving on their own. So there's two components to the motion. But from the discovery and the follow-up image, they were pretty quickly able to fit an orbit, so a path that the object was going to follow. And they were able to determine that it was going to have, or that it already had gone through its closest approach to the sun, and it went within about 0.25 AU of the sun. So a little bit closer to the sun than even Mercury is, and that it has an orbital eccentricity bigger than 1. So orbital eccentricity is a measurement of how elongated an orbit is, but an orbital eccentricity above 1 means the orbit is not a closed path. So orbital eccentricities below 1 are ellipses. So those are closed paths that will repeatedly orbit the sun. But this really big eccentricity is how we knew it was on a hyperbolic orbit and it was not going to return. So they very quickly realized they had this really cool object. We've never had an interstellar visitor confirmed before. So they got a bunch of observatories on it and started doing follow-up observations. And one of the most basic things we do for small bodies in the solar system is we look for brightness variations over time, because this can tell us about the shape of an object. So if you imagine a spherical object, because most objects are rotating, so if a spherical object that's rotating will stay the same apparent brightness no matter where in its rotation it is, because it's just a sphere. There's no variations in how much surface area there is to reflect light back toward us. But what they saw with Oumuamua was that it was undergoing these really big brightness variations that you can see in these big deep V's. And those brightness variations were repeating on a roughly 8-hour cadence. So I'll note that the y-axis on this plot, so the x-axis is time, and the y-axis is magnitude in a particular filter. And if you are not super familiar with the astronomical magnitude system, I'll remind you that it is not a linear scale. So every step in magnitude is a factor of at least 2 in brightness. So going from 22nd magnitude, and larger magnitudes are fainter, which is an annoying convention. But so 22nd magnitude is reasonably bright by solar system standards. 25th magnitude is incredibly faint. And you can only observe 25th magnitude objects with really big telescopes. So a 25th magnitude object, you'd better be using at least a 4-meter telescope to observe. Whereas a 22nd magnitude object, you can easily get good data on that with a 2-meter telescope. So you have to go up a factor of 2 in telescope size to observe it at the biggest dip in its brightness level. So they're able to observe this light curve, and then what you can do is you can infer the shape of the object based on that light curve. And the answer for Oumuamua is very bizarre. So based on those huge dips, we obviously know it's not a sphere. So it has to be some weird shape. And there's kind of 2 possible solutions. Light curves are a little bit tricky. There's always multiple possible solutions because of the viewing geometry. But the answer is that either Oumuamua was kind of Millennium Falcon shaped, with its biggest dimension being about 6 times larger than its smallest dimension, so kind of pancakey. Or it was cigar-shaped, where its longest dimension was about 10 times wider than its shortest dimension. And those are pretty extreme. And we know that its biggest dimension was roughly maybe 100 to as much as 1,000 meters. And the reason why that's uncertain is that we are only observing this object in reflected light. So the reflectivity of the surface, if you have a really like a mirror-like surface that's very good at reflecting light, then for the same brightness, you can have a smaller object. But if it's a really dark surface that's bad at reflecting light, then you need a larger object. So that's why there's a pretty big uncertainty range there. Now, we have plenty of kind of weirdly shaped objects in the solar system. So this is a variety of comets and asteroids, but none of them are quite as extreme as Oumuamua. Kind of a 3-to-1 aspect ratio or a 4-to-1 is kind of the weirdest we get in the solar system. So 6-to-1 or even 10-to-1 is quite bizarre. Otherwise, the color of Oumuamua was pretty consistent with other small bodies in the solar system. So what we like to do with small bodies is we image them in multiple color filters, and then we compare the brightness in those filters and make all sorts of color plots. So in this one, objects that are really red are up here. So, Oumuamua is the star here, and then there's a bunch of other solar system objects plotted. So it's not weird in terms of color. We also did a pretty deep search to look for cometary activity to see if there were any ices, water ice, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, anything like that coming off of the surface of the object. So remember, this thing came in to within 0.25 AU of the sun. So it got flash heated basically right before we observed it. But we didn't see any cometary activity. And that is actually quite puzzling. So, we've got this object that it has a weird shape. There was no apparent outgassing, which we'll explain why that's weird in a slide. And then the last little bit of weirdness was that we tracked it very carefully on its way out of the solar system. And it didn't follow the path we think it should follow if it was only being subjected to the gravitational influence of bodies in the solar system. So there's a tiny bit of non-gravitational acceleration on its way out. So why is the lack of outgassing weird? That's really weird because if we go back to thinking about solar system formation, we remember that we're forming things out of a disk of gas and dust around the sun. Of course, closest to the protosun, the disk is hot, and farther away it gets colder. So closest to the sun, the only things that can condense out of the gas to make solids to then build solid objects are metals and rocks. And this is kind of traditionally why we think, the terrestrial planets are mostly made of metals and rocks. They are dense objects, and that kind of makes sense in this picture of early solar system formation, because they probably formed in the inner solar system where the nebula was hotter. And as you go out, you get to the point where it cools down enough that water ice can condense. And then even further out, you can get other ices, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrogen. They can also condense. So the reason we think that the vast majority of small bodies that get ejected from a solar system should be made of these more volatile ices is because the most abundant things in the protoplanetary disk are things that make up ices. So we have hydrogen, we have oxygen, we have carbon. So all of those are important contributions to water ice, methane, ammonia, nitrogen ice. So those should be really abundant materials. So when we are looking at how much solid material should be forming in the solar system, once you're far enough out in the disk that you can condense water ice and all of these other ices, you suddenly have way more building blocks than you do closer to the sun. So this is also why, the giant planets in our solar system, which are predominantly, hydrogen and helium and water ice, those form further out in the disk. So we just think that in general, most of the stuff that you build planetesimals out of should be ices. And in our own solar system, that's certainly true. Those 10 to 30 Earth masses of stuff we chucked out into the interstellar medium when we were forming our giant planets were mostly icy bodies like Kuiper Belt objects and comets. So it was really quite unexpected that our first interstellar visitor would not show any outgassing. We really, really expected a comet to be our first interstellar visitor. And outgassing would have explained, non-gravitational accelerations. So I've said it's weird, but, and I see a mention of a certain astronomer in the chat, you should not jump to aliens just because you've seen something weird. So to say his name, Avi Loeb has been on a tear the last several years saying that the best explanation for Oumuamua is that it's actually an alien spaceship that visited our solar system. So this is just an image from one of the news stories. So the idea would be that it's like a light sail style spaceship, which is a kind of interstellar probe that we've been thinking about, we in the most general sense. If you wanted to send spacecraft to nearby stars, a particularly low energy way to do it would be with solar sails that propel themselves using radiation forces by just having a really large surface area. So he has jumped to this conclusion based on the fact that there were some non-gravitational accelerations and the fact that the shape of Oumuamua is really weird. But I will say he is standing alone on this. No one agrees with him. And I'll just go through some of the reasons why it's an extremely premature thing to assume. So in terms of the shape, we only observed this thing in 2017. It takes a while to think of ideas and publish papers about them. When we see something new, we have to go, how could we possibly explain that? You go to conferences, you talk with people, and you bounce ideas. So one idea that got published just last year was that maybe it got stretched out by tides if it had a really close encounter with its own star, or maybe even a different star in the galaxy before it entered the solar system. So this is a plot showing you could have circular spherical objects coming in. If they get too close to a star, the differential gravity from the point on the object closest to the star and the point farthest from the star could spread out the object into a really elongated shape. And in fact, when this happened, that might also explain why it could have lost so much of its volatile, those ices, because those would have sublimated during this process. So, there's some issues with this theory. People are still testing it, but that's one idea. Literally yesterday, there was another pair of papers published to try to explain the weird shape and the lack of outgassing. So this was Dash and Jackson. So they're suggesting that in Oumuamua's home solar system, there was like a Pluto-sized object that underwent a collision, and Oumuamua is one of the fragments that came off of the object from the collision. And when you have a large enough object like Pluto, you can have parts of the surface that are dominated by nitrogen ice instead of water ice. So maybe Oumuamua was a nitrogen ice rich object that came off of this Pluto-like object. Nitrogen ice being the key because it sublimates at much lower temperatures. So as it went through the galaxy, its shape could have been eroded by galactic cosmic rays, which are really high energy particles floating around the galaxy. That enters the solar system. If it was nitrogen ice, it would have outgassed pretty far from the sun, so it could very easily have lost its volatiles before we saw it on its way out of the solar system. But there could have still been some residuals perhaps to explain the outgassing. Perhaps a simpler explanation for the lack of outgassing is that we should have kicked some purely rocky bodies out into the interstellar medium when the planets were rearranging themselves, so just asteroids instead of comets. It's rare, but maybe we just got kind of unlucky. And then as for the non-gravitational accelerations, I'll say our observations aren't perfect. If there was just a very small amount of outgassing, it's possible we just didn't have sensitive enough instruments to observe it. And you only need, I think it's like millimeters of ice to sublimate to explain the non-gravitational accelerations. So just, give us a few more years to think about this, and I'm sure we'll come up with better explanations. Really just don't jump to aliens. Like when you see a weird rock, it probably just is a weird rock. And the claim that it's an alien spaceship would require extraordinary evidence, and we don't have extraordinary evidence. And in fact, Avi Loeb's trying to sell you his book. So I don't know, just because you're a Harvard professor doesn't mean your ideas are good. But on to our second interstellar visitor, which was actually a huge relief in 2019, because this one was a comet like we expected. So this is a Hubble Space Telescope image of comet 2I Borisov. And you can see that nice, gorgeous coma of gas coming off of the nucleus that we cannot resolve in this image. And that was definitely a relief. If we had gotten 2 Oumuamuas in a row, that would have been concerning. So at least half of our visitors are normal. Borisov is also great because we had more time to observe it. So this is a graphic from the New York Times showing the relative paths of Borisov here in white and gray versus Oumuamua in orange here. So remember, Oumuamua, we only detected it after it went through perihelion. So we only caught it on its way out of the solar system. So we literally only were able to observe it for about 30 days. So that's not very much time. Whereas Borisov was detected on its way in. It also was a little bit bigger probably and a little bit brighter. So we had more time on its way out to observe it as well. So we had ended up with about a year's worth of observational tracking and characterization of Borisov. And there's a lot more you can do in a year than you can do in 30 days. So we got a lot of data. It means we could get things like spectra to determine exactly what kind of ices were coming off of its surface. So this is, and we could see how that changed over time even. So this is a spectra from the Large Binocular Telescope from, over a 10-day span in October, showing that this spectral feature associated with CN gas was going up. There was no association with C2 gas, so we can then actually start to compare compositions with solar system compositions. And so like we got just a lot more information, and it turns out the composition is pretty similar to solar system comets, not that different. And then it was also bright enough that we were able to observe it with smaller telescopes. So I included these images because I took them, and I'm only an occasional observer, so it was really fun to happen to be on the telescope when this thing was visible. So we were taking data in different filters to see, you take data in the red filter to see what the dust distribution is coming off the comet. And then you can have filters targeted at specific gas emission lines. So, there are still a lot of papers to come based on that 1 year of data. Often papers take several years to really finish and publish. So we are just seeing the start of the Borisov papers. On to the future of what we can hope to learn from interstellar objects, because a sample size of 2 is not very good. We are really close to starting a big new project in astronomical observing. So the Vera Rubin Observatory is going to be running the LSST survey, which has been backronymed to be the Legacy Survey of Space and Time. It used to stand for something else. They are going to do a 10-year survey of a huge portion of the sky. So this is the telescope under construction in South America. So it's going to cover the entire southern sky and part of the northern sky. It's going to image every part of the visible sky every 2 weeks or so over a 10-year portion. And based on our sample size of 2, which we can then wildly extrapolate to how many objects we can expect to observe, we think about 1 every year is the expected discovery rate once LSST is in operation. So, take that to mean we're quite confident we'll get at least 1 more over the 10-year period. If we're lucky, maybe we'll get several a year. That's a pretty uncertain estimate, but it's really, really exciting. And then another upcoming project is the Comet Interceptor mission. So this is a European Space Agency mission that will launch in 2028. Now, it's not specifically to study interstellar objects, but what they're going to do is they're going to launch their spacecraft. It's going to then go hang out in one of the Earth's Lagrange points. So it's going to co-orbit with the Earth, and it's going to wait as long as possible for us to discover a target to send it to. So the thing with comets is that by the time we see them coming, you don't have enough time to build and launch a spacecraft to go visit it. So if you want to send an object to one of these either long period comets out of the Oort cloud or an interstellar object, the spacecraft has to be in space and waiting. So they are launching, they expect to discover a target during the LSST survey, and then they will pick a comet to visit. So it's likely to be a long period comet, but it's also possible that an interstellar object could come through at the right location for a comet interceptor to go study. And it's a really cool thing. It basically is a main spacecraft with 2 CubeSats that are being built by the Japanese Space Agency. So whenever they pick their target, they'll send 1 spacecraft and then 2 basically on the other side. So it's a really cool mission concept. So, we still want to know, are we right about the fact that most of the interstellar visitors should be cometary, made of ices? If we're not right about that, we need to rethink a little bit of our planet formation models. We want to know how the long trip through interstellar space affects the physical properties of these objects. We want to know if there's any hope of tracing the individual visitors to their home systems where they formed, which is kind of a really tricky prospect. So I wouldn't put money on that, but we'll get much bigger sample sizes from these future surveys. And so we can make better extrapolations when we're not just extrapolating from a sample size of 2. So that's my main talk. I see that there are a couple questions in the chat. Martin, do you want me to start with the questions from the chat? Or I guess, how do we want to open that up?
Yeah, why don't we do a couple of questions from chat, and then as people have a moment to formulate their questions, they can jump in on, to all participants, you can unmute yourselves and pop in with a question, or drop the question in chat. But Kat, if you want to address some in chat before we get to people jumping in. And
Yep. So there is a question about whether we know where 1I Oumuamua is headed. We do know its trajectory. We did as much tracking as possible on its way out of the solar system. So in that sense, we know where it's immediately headed, but on longer timescales, the timescales over which it might visit another stellar system, it's harder to track these objects because we don't have a perfect map of all of the gravitational influences in the galaxy. This is also the problem with trying to track it back to its home system. If you go enough tens or hundreds of millions of years, either in the future or the past, the uncertainties just get really big. So someone else saw speculation early on about what star might have been in the right position to have ejected Oumuamua. So there are some current guesses, but I would classify them as slightly wild guesses. I think there was a paper that ruled it down to maybe a stellar cluster as a possible. So there's at best a guess of maybe 50 or 100 possible home stars. And there's not much better we can do on that. So I think those were and then also, yes, the Millennium Falcon might not be the best comparison for Oumuamua, given that I don't like the spaceship, but I just can't help but see the Falcon in that particular painting. So yeah, if anybody has questions they'd like to ask.
Well, I think the big hope is that Ewoks are a real thing and we'll be able to meet them.
Will James Webb get us any better idea of looking for stuff like this or not?
So
Or after we
James
find
Webb-
it, I guess.
Yeah, so it'll be better for after we find things. So James Webb will have a pretty small field of view, and the time on space telescopes is extraordinarily precious. So they usually don't let us do surveys for unknown things using space telescope resources. But if we had had James Webb, for example, when Oumuamua came through, we could have done a much more sensitive search for outgassing. So as it was, our best attempt to measure the outgassing was using the aging Spitzer Space Telescope, which is fully dead now. It ran out. It was a cryogenically cooled infrared observatory. So, the wavelength range kept changing over time as the cryogen was running out and the telescope was warming up. So, it was good constraints. We know that if it was outgassing, it was only outgassing a little bit, but James Webb would have been better. So that is promising, assuming that launches later this year. I hope it does, but
Thank you.
I won't believe James Webb is reality until it's actually in space.
This is Carrie here. I just wanted to thank you, Kat, for this presentation. It was awesome. There's a lot of students in the audience, and I think that your pitch for tonight's talk was just right. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I always love spreading the gospel about how interesting small bodies are. It's my favorite part of the solar system. There's a question, do we know what shape Borisov is? The answer to that is no. So there's upsides and downsides to a body outgassing. The upside is that we can get a good sense of its composition because it's spewing things into space nicely for us to observe. But the downside is that all of that gas and dust coming off of it obscures the shape of the object at the center. So that's why we don't have a fabulous size estimate for Borisov, because we can't resolve the actual nucleus. We have limits. We think it's, it's not 5 kilometers. It's probably half a kilometer across, but we don't have any constraints on the shape at all.
I have a question, if I may ask. Are we observing the solar system adequately to make sure that anything that passes through our solar system we observe, or is it possible that something could pass through without our seeing it?
Most things pass through without us seeing it. So I think the estimates are that there's probably about 5 of these objects per year coming through the solar system that we have failed to see. Now, of course, it depends on a lot of assumptions. So a lot of the things passing through our solar system are going to be very small. So general rule of thumb in small body populations, there's always way more small things than there are big things. So, if we have a 10-meter object coming through the solar system from interstellar space, the odds of us observing it are vanishingly small because it would have to come incredibly close to the Earth for it to be bright enough in reflected sunlight for us to see it. So we're probably missing lots of really small things. But even things the size of Oumuamua and Borisov, they have to be coming through at the right geometry for them to get bright enough. So like if they were passing through on the opposite side of the sun from where we were, interstellar objects are going quite fast. So they could zoom through and out without ever being bright enough for us to detect. Now that's why our detections should go up during LSST, because it will represent a significant improvement in our tracking. So it's a big telescope. It'll be able to see fainter things, and it's dedicated just to repeatedly observing the sky for transient objects. So, but we still miss a lot of things. So a question in the chat, was it inevitable that the gravitational pull of the sun would have brought it so close? Or yeah, could a similar body have taken a path through the outer solar system? Yeah, certainly things could have very distant encounters with the sun and, just get very gently tweaked by the gravity of the sun and never make it into the inner solar system. So we call that the impact parameter of the encounter. So if the impact parameter is 10 AU, that means it would never get closer than Saturn to the sun. So that would also dramatically decrease the odds that we see the object because it'd be farther away. So where is LSST being built? That I had to Google real quick. I should know, I'm on one of the science collaborations, but I always forget exactly where the site. It's in South America. La Serena, Chile. Yeah. So it's a US-led project with a lot of international partners. There's a couple preferred sites around the world for building these large observatories due to elevation and weather. So you want the observatory as high up as you can to get above as much atmosphere as you can. And you got to pick a site where you're not going to be clouded out a significant fraction of the year. So Chile, Hawaii, and a few other locations. So another question, how fast was it going? Are there any expectations on how fast we think such objects can go? So I don't know offhand the speed that these objects were going at their closest approach. We tend to characterize these things by a parameter called the velocity at infinity, which is basically how fast it was going in the interstellar region before it was gravitationally affected by the solar system. So Oumuamua was going at about 25 kilometers per second through the interstellar medium. And we do have a good idea of what the speed distribution should be, because that velocity at infinity, the speed at which these things are going, is determined by how they're ejected from their home planetary systems. So, we have models of that speed distribution. I don't know offhand what Borisov's V infinity was. It was a little bit slower than Oumuamua's, I think. So that actually does tell us something about also how long they've been bouncing around the interstellar medium, because if they've been out in the interstellar medium for long enough to have had encounters with multiple star systems, that will change their velocity compared to something that was just ejected from its home system. So I think the estimate was Oumuamua has not visited other solar systems before. But yeah, no, not relativistic velocities, so fast, but it's basically the velocity kick you get from a planet to get you unbound from your home star. Any other questions?
Martin?
Sorry, one last question out there about Oumuamua's name. So Oumuamua is Hawaiian for visitor, I believe. So it is one of the native Hawaiian languages because it was discovered using a telescope in Hawaii. And Borisov comets are named after their discoverers. Small bodies are rocky small bodies are not necessarily. So Borisov is a guy who discovered 2I Borisov and a bunch of other comets. Oumuamua got a more romantic name.
Martin, would you like to remind folks about what's coming up next month? And close
Yeah,
this
absolutely.
out? Yeah.
So first and foremost, I want to say a big thanks to Dr. Volk. Great presentation overall, very informative, engaging. Even just from the comments and personal experience, the graphics and just presentation were very engaging, wonderful.
Thank you.
So very much appreciated. Next month, April 15th, we're going to have Dr. Jen Locke. She's a material scientist at Ohio State University giving a talk. She's already been granted the National Science Foundation Career Award, a number of things like that. And my dog Lily is championing both Dr. Locke and Dr. Volk. They had a rousing chorus when Dr. Volk mentioned that just because you're at Harvard doesn't mean you have good ideas. So I assume that's what they're barking about, and not just a dog walking by the house. Anyhow, April 15th, we're going to have another lecture. Like I said, Dr. Locke is a material scientist. Her undergrad was Wittenberg University, where Kat and I went, and Dr. Locke did her grad work at Virginia and then is now at Ohio State. So I look forward to having you all next month as well. I really appreciate everyone's time and great questions as well. So I look forward to speaking with you soon. And also big welcome to everyone who is from Wittenberg. I know a couple of professors that Dr. Volk and I had are on the line, and the Society of Physics students, I think there's a few of them here, and just general people there as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, and hope to see you all next month. Good night.
Thanks, everyone.